Welcome to the feedback discussion session for week 4 on the topic of building resilience to flooding in cities. We have today again Professor Tony Wong, the Chief Executive of the Cooperative Research Centre for Water Sensitive Cities, based here in Monash, Melbourne. Tony, the response to this week has been full of enthusiasm and quite some insight, particularly people who live in areas that are, where flooding has occurred have their own views on the way in which resilience should be developed in their city. Within that context, there was one very good question someone asked, and I'll read it out. And the question is, why does a resilience framework start with the retreat, adapt and defend? Don't you feel that it should be the other way? Defend, adapt, retreat. As they say, defence is the first line of protection and retreat is the final recourse in any situation. Interesting question, but I'm sure you have a response to that.
Well, it is an interesting question, but I think perhaps you may be reading too much into the sequence of the three activities. In fact, it's not hierarchical, or does it necessarily need to follow those sequence? What it does is nevertheless captures quite different response to how you would build resilience to floods. The notion of retreat is very much a planning response, appropriate land uses and so on. And quite often it also perhaps reflects the fact that there are places that are just inappropriate for high density or for human habitation. And so the notion of retreat is simply the principle of making room for the river, living with floods in your environment and so on. Of course, if you look at it from a perspective of an urbanized environment, you would say, well, defense ought to be the first thing we do. But that's an incredibly sort of technocratic response to flood management. And quite often that response do not really recognize the importance of needing to live in harmony with nature and in harmony with and also to build the resilience to a lot of uncertainties as far as nature is concerned. Adapt is one whereby it clearly recognizes that human habitation, urban environment needs to work and live in harmony with nature, and the adaptation of that means that those two cannot be viewed as separate entities. It really needs to be brought together. Defense is really a case of doing the best you can with perhaps some poor planning decisions in the past, or perhaps with planning decisions that were made without accommodating future uncertainties. You can't move cities out. They are expensive infrastructure that are now flood prone, and you need to think about structural defense in that sense. But please don't read it as a hierarchical approach, nor is it a sequential approach. It really just captures the quite different responses to building flood resilience.
Exactly. And the common theme in this course has been that every situation requires a different, more thoughtful approach.
Yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all or a silver bullet to solve these problems.
In fact, in any city, you will see all three elements involved.
Yeah. A second question that has been raised, or an issue, comes from Mary Donhau's presentation. And of course, I think she is full of enthusiasm, but also life experience, having lived in an area not on the high ground, as it were, thinking she wasn't going to be subject to flooding, and all of a sudden her property is flooded. And she asks the question, well, why did this happen? And then she says, well, actually, when you think about it, we have a lot of information. We as citizens, as residents, have information that will help the planners. And I think quite often in this course, particularly in week 6, we talk about the social dimensions of planning. But in this week, it does illustrate that citizens and community representatives can make an input to strategies for flood resilience. You might want to comment on that, and where have you seen this done well, if you have seen it done well? That is the issue of getting community involved in developing strategies.
Well, I think that that's a really insightful comment, in the sense that we need to think about flood resilience both in terms of the social resilience as well as some of the infrastructure resilience. We often think resilience is mainly about infrastructure, but in fact, the social resilience on even for community to understand the concept of risk, to understand that you cannot rely on government or infrastructure to completely eliminate the risks. And therefore, if community understands the risk, they also understand how issues of preparedness, emergency response, and recovery, and they are all key elements of building resilience. And if that can be strengthened together with structural and policy from government side, then you have a total integrated resilience package in that sense. And of course, the personal experience of flood do need to feed back to issues of how government assists with emergency planning, emergency response, and of course recovery. The one example that sticks to my mind in relation to the strength of social resilience is in fact the Brisbane floods, whereby there was a huge flood, as some of you may know.
Of course, we had Pete Fillett. He gave a presentation this week.
Well, the Brisbane flood is fantastic because the amount of community support that led to the quick recovery of Brisbane following the flood was astonishing. In fact, I have colleagues that from the Netherlands who came out to visit to actually have a look at how Brisbane recovered from the flood, and they were just completely impressed and amazed because they had a look at how it was like in terms of in New Orleans after Katrina, and how the community resilience was not there. So the rate of recovery was just entirely dependent on government and government aid. While in Brisbane, it was very much a community-led recovery, and government was merely there to provide the support and the infrastructure of transporting people to clean up and so on. So that is really great. But what was lacking in Brisbane, of course, was that the social resilience didn't come from a great understanding of flood risk. And now they're building that to basically look at understanding of flood risk and using that to help flood preparedness by community in that sense, and the information that goes up. So that's the one that constantly sticks to my mind in terms of how my colleagues were incredibly impressed, having had the experience of how New Orleans recovered from their floods compared to Brisbane.
And in week 6, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be looking at the role that governments play, and sort of network governance, local government in particular has a significant part to play in developing these strategies. And I think if local governments do not listen to what their community is saying, they do it at their own peril. Conversely, of course, if they do engage at that level, the outcomes are much better and much more sustainable. And I think the communities expect that from their local governments and their state governments.
Absolutely. I think that you'll find in other places where local government perhaps don't engage and listen to community, there's then the tendency that the community expects the government to be able to look after everything. And they basically do not assume some of the responsibility in responding to floods. So the whole notion really is that a lot of our flood management plan, a lot of our looking at recovery plan, emergency planning, they need to be co-developed with communities.
Okay. Well, thanks, Tony.
Pleasure.
Next week, week 5, we're looking at the role that planning plays in, and what role that water plays in planning to develop resilient and livable outcomes, particularly on the emphasis on livability. So that's next week. The following week is about the social components, the governance, institutional arrangements, and the final week, week 7, is about how to bring this together. How do you establish the business case and influence decision makers to deliver water-sensitive cities? So we hope you're enjoying the course. We'll see you next week. Thanks, Tony.
Cheers.
Bye.